The heavy bronze doors of history do not usually creak. They slam. But on the night of October 30th, 1503, the doors of the Apostolic Palace in Rome did something far worse. They locked from the inside. Imagine you are there. The air in Rome is turning crisp with the coming of winter, but inside these walls the heat is suffocating. It is the scent of 500 candles melting at once, the musk of expensive perfumes, and the metallic tang of wine spilled on ancient marble. You are standing in a room designed to reflect the glory of God, but as you look around, you realize that God has been evicted. In his place sits a family that has turned the papacy into a criminal syndicate, a throne of blood, and a theater of the perverse. This is not a ghost story, though it is haunted. This is not a work of fiction, though it beggars belief. This is the documented account of the most infamous night in the history of the Catholic Church, the Banquet of Chestnuts. But to understand why 50 women were forced to crawl like animals before the princes of the church, we have to understand the family that pulled the strings. We have to understand the house of Borgia. To the Italians of the 15th century, the Borgias were a virus. They were Catalans, outsiders from Spain, who had come to Rome not to serve, but to conquer. At the head of this family was Rodrigo Borgia, known to history as Pope Alexander VI. Rodrigo did not become pope through prayer or divine intervention. He'd bought the papacy. During the conclave of 1492, gold-laden mules were seen traveling between the palaces of various cardinals. Votes were traded like cattle. When the white smoke finally rose, the man who stepped onto the balcony was a man who already had 4 recognized children and a string of mistresses. He was a titan of appetite for power, for women, and for legacy. But Rodrigo was only half of the nightmare. Beside him stood his son, Cesare Borgia. If Rodrigo was the fire, Cesare was the ice. Cesare was a man of such singular, terrifying ambition that he inspired Niccolò Machiavelli to write The Prince. He was a man who resigned his position as a cardinal, the first in history to do so, not out of humbleness, but because a cardinal's robes were too restrictive for a man who wanted to wear a crown of iron. Cesare was the Borgia executioner. He moved through Italy like a plague, toppling city-states, betraying allies, and murdering anyone who stood in his path, including, many believe, his own brother, Juan. And then there was Lucrezia. The world remembers her as a poisoner, a woman with a hollow ring filled with arsenic. But the archives tell a different story. They tell the story of a girl used as a political pawn, married off at 13, then again at 17, then again at 21. Each marriage was a bridge for her father's ambition. Once the bridge was crossed, the husband was discarded. Her first husband was publicly humiliated and forced to admit to impotence. Her second husband, Alfonso of Aragon, was a different story. Lucrezia actually loved him. But love is a liability in the Borgia household. Cesare had Alfonso strangled in his bed within the Vatican walls. Lucrezia was forced to live in the palace where her husband's blood was still staining the floor. By the autumn of 1503, the Borgias were at the height of their terrifying power, but shadows were closing in. The Pope was aging. Cesare was becoming increasingly erratic. They needed a final massive alliance to secure their future. They set their sights on the house of Este, the rulers of Ferrara. The Este family was one of the oldest and most respected in Italy. To marry a Borgia was, to them, a death sentence for their reputation. Alfonso d'Este, the heir to Ferrara, fought the marriage with everything he had. He sent diplomats to plead with the Pope. He offered massive bribes to the French king to intervene. He even considered fleeing the country. But the Borgias held the ultimate weapon, excommunication. If Alfonso refused, the Pope would declare his entire family heretics. Their lands would be seized, their people would be released from their vows of loyalty, and their enemies would be invited to tear Ferrara apart. Alfonso X surrendered. He began his journey to Rome in December, riding through mountain passes choked with snow. He felt like a man riding to his own execution. He knew that in Rome he wouldn't just be marrying a woman. He would be entering a den of vipers. While Alfonso was riding toward his fate, the Vatican was preparing. But they weren't just preparing for a wedding. They were preparing for a demonstration. Pope Alexander and Cesare wanted to show the world, and specifically the noble families of Italy, that they were untouchable. They wanted to prove that they could turn the most sacred rituals into the most profane acts, and that no one, not even the College of Cardinals, would dare to whisper a word of protest. This brings us to the night of October 30th. The wedding ceremony had been performed. The political contracts had been signed. But the Borgias weren't finished. They invited 50 of the most beautiful and high-status courtesans in Rome to a private banquet in the Pope's personal apartments. These women were told they were there to entertain. They were told it was a night of celebration. They were not told that they were about to become the instruments of a psychological massacre. As the sun set over the Tiber River, the guests began to arrive. Cardinals in their scarlet silks, ambassadors from across Europe, and the terrified groom, Alfonso X. They sat at long tables, groaning under the weight of roasted meats, exotic fruits, and the finest wines in Christendom. Music played from the galleries. On the surface it looked like the pinnacle of Renaissance refinement. But Johann Burchard, the Vatican's master of ceremonies, stood in the corner, his hand clutching his ledger, his face pale. He saw the guards positioning themselves at the exits. He saw Cesare Borgia whispering to his father, a dark smile playing on his lips. The atmosphere began to change. The toasts became more aggressive. The laughter of the Pope grew louder, echoing off the frescos of saints. And then, at a signal from Cesare, the side doors opened. The 50 women were led in. What happened next was not a party. It was the systematic stripping away of every layer of human decency. It began with the command for the women to dance. But as the music grew faster, the commands became more extreme. Under the direct orders of the Vicar of Christ, the women were told to remove their clothes. Silks, velvets, and laces fell to the floor. In the heart of the Vatican, beneath the gaze of the Holy Father, 50 naked women stood before the highest authorities of the Church. The room went silent, save for the crackling of the fire and the heavy breathing of the men at the tables. This was the moment where someone should have stood up. A cardinal should have walked out. A guard should have lowered his head in shame. But no one moved. The Borgias watched the faces of their guests, savoring the shock, the disgust, and ultimately the submission. Then came the baskets. Large baskets filled with chestnuts were brought into the center of the hall. The Pope leaned forward, his eyes bright with a feverish light. He didn't want the women to just stand there. He wanted them to crawl. He ordered the chestnuts to be scattered across the marble floor, between the legs of the tables, under the chairs of the cardinals, and into the dark corners of the room. The command was given. The women were to gather the chestnuts, using only their mouths and their hands, crawling on all fours like animals. To make it a game, prizes were offered: expensive silks, shoes, and gold coins for those who could perform the best in this state of degradation. Imagine the sound, the clicking of the chestnuts on the marble, the quiet weeping of the women, the rustle of scarlet robes as cardinals shifted in their seats to get a better view, and above it all, the booming laughter of Rodrigo Borgia. He was pointing, making jokes, calling out to his daughter and his new son-in-law to watch the festivities. This was the Banquet of Chestnuts. It was a ritual of humiliation designed to show that in the Borgia Vatican, nothing was holy. But as the midnight bells began to toll, the Pope realized that he had one more lesson to teach. He looked at Alfonso d'Este and Lucrezia, and he gave the final, most horrific order of the night. The midnight bells of Rome have finished their tolling. The game of the chestnuts has left the 50 women exhausted, huddled in the corners of the hall, their dignity shattered on the cold marble. But Pope Alexander VI was not a man satisfied with mere preludes. He was a man who understood that power is only absolute when it leaves its victims with nothing, not even the privacy of their own skin. He turned his gaze from the floor to the head table. There sat Lucrezia, her face a mask of frozen porcelain, and Alfonso d'Este, the Prince of Ferrara, whose knuckles were white from gripping the edge of the table. The Pope raised his goblet, the wine dark as Venus blood, and issued the command that would haunt the halls of the Vatican for the next 5 centuries. "The marriage is contracted," the Pope declared, his voice booming with a terrifying joviality. "But a contract is only paper. Tonight it must be flesh." In the 16th century, the consummation of a royal marriage was a political necessity. Usually it involved a brief ceremony where witnesses saw the couple enter a room and then left them in peace. But the Borgias didn't do usually. Alexander VI ordered that the doors to the bridal chamber remain wide open. He ordered that the candles be kept burning bright. And then he demanded that the act be performed not once, but 3 times, and that every cardinal, every ambassador, and every guard remain in place to witness it. This was the triple shame. It was a public execution of the soul. Alfonso d'Este, a man raised on the rigid codes of chivalry and noble honor, was forced to lead Lucrezia into that chamber. Under the leering eyes of her father and her brother, there was no love in that room. There was only the cold, sharp edge of a blade held at the throat of their families. Cesare Borgia stood at the threshold, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, watching his sister with a gaze that many contemporary chroniclers described as incestuous and predatory. The silence in the outer hall was deafening. Johann Burchard, the master of ceremonies, stood with his eyes fixed on the floor, his quill scratching frantically in his diary. He was recording the end of an era. He knew that as long as these walls stood, they would carry the stain of this night. Some of the younger cardinals, drunk and broken by the spectacle, began to laugh. The older ones simply prayed in silence, realizing that the man they called Holy Father had successfully dragged the papacy into the mud of the streets. By the time the first pale gray light of dawn began to bleed through the stained glass windows, the ordeal was finished. The Pope was satisfied. The alliance with Ferrara was now irrevocable, not because of love, but because Alfonso d'Este was now tied to the Borgias by a bond of shared trauma and public humiliation. He could never claim the marriage wasn't valid. He could never turn back. But the sun rose on a different world. The Banquet of Chestnuts and the night that followed didn't stay within the walls of the Vatican. Like a poison gas, the news began to leak out. Ambassadors wrote encoded letters to their kings. The Venetian envoy, a man who had seen the worst of war, wrote back to his doge in a state of shock, claiming that what has occurred in the palace of the Pope surpasses the sins of Nero and Caligula. Within weeks, the courts of London, Paris, and Madrid were whispering about the theater of hell in Rome. The immediate aftermath for the couple was a living death. Alfonso d'Este left Rome as quickly as he could, taking Lucrezia with him to Ferrara. He never spoke of that night again. He treated Lucrezia with a cold, distant respect, but the warmth of a true marriage had been extinguished before it ever began. Lucrezia, desperate to wash the Borgia blood from her hands, turned to religion and charity. She became a patron of the arts, trying to surround herself with beauty to drown out the memories of the Apostolic Palace. She wore a hair shirt under her silk gowns, a secret penance for sins she was forced to participate in. She died at the age of 39, exhausted by the weight of her own name. But for the Borgias themselves, the clock was ticking. Divine justice, or perhaps just the law of averages, was coming for them. In August 1503, less than a year after the banquet, both the Pope and Cesare fell violently ill after a dinner in a vineyard. The symptoms were horrific. Their skin turned black and began to peel, their stomachs swelled, and they suffered from agonizing convulsions. Many believed they had been poisoned with their own cantarella, the secret Borgia toxin. Pope Alexander VI died in a state of delirium. His body decomposed so rapidly and so grotesquely that no priest wanted to touch him. They eventually had to cram his bloated corpse into a coffin that was too small, literally jumping on the lid to close it. It was a fittingly violent end for a man who had treated the world as his footstool. Cesare survived the illness, but his power was tied to his father's life. The moment the Pope died, Cesare's enemies rose like a tide. He was hunted across Italy, imprisoned in Spain, and finally died in a desperate, lonely skirmish in 1507. His body was stripped naked and left in a ditch, a mirror of the nakedness he had forced upon others in the Vatican. But the true legacy of October 30th, 1503, was not the death of a family. It was the birth of a revolution. A few years later, an obscure German monk named Martin Luther traveled to Rome. He heard the stories. He saw the luxury built on the backs of the poor and the depravity practiced in the halls of power. The memory of the Borgia papacy became the fuel for his fire. When he nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg, the Banquet of Chestnuts was one of the invisible nails he hammered into the coffin of papal supremacy. He called the Vatican the whore of Babylon, and after the Borgias, the world found it very hard to disagree. The Catholic Church eventually launched a counter-reformation, a desperate attempt to clean its house and erase the memory of the Borgias. They tried to destroy Burchard's diary. They tried to repaint the frescos. They tried to turn the Borgias into a myth, a set of lies told by enemies. But history is not so easily buried. The archives remained, the letters survived. And today, when we look at the Vatican, we are not just looking at a place of prayer. We are looking at a crime scene. The story of the Borgia apocalypse is a warning that echoes across half a millennium. It tells us that power, when it becomes absolute, loses its humanity. It tells us that the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones hiding in the shadows, but the ones sitting on thrones, dressed in silk, claiming to speak for God. And it asks us one final haunting question. If you were in that room that night, if you saw the women crawling, if you saw the dignity of two people being systematically destroyed, Would you have stayed silent to save your own life? Or would you have been the one to finally scream, no? The Borgias are gone, their palaces are museums, their bones are dust. But the darkness they invited into the world that night in October, that darkness is still here. It's waiting for the next person who believes that their power makes them untouchable. This has been the story of the House of Borgia. This is Crimson Historians. We don't just tell stories, we exhume them. If you want to keep digging into the shadows of the past with us, subscribe and hit the bell, because the truth is often far more terrifying than the legend.